everyone, it's CrystalJae. Welcome back to Auntie Sermons. If you're new here, this is a podcast where we go back through the Bible and slow the story down. But instead of centering the men, we center the women. Every girl, every woman, whether she's named in the text or completely unnamed. We walk through the Bible chronologically and give sermons to the women the story barely pauses to notice. Go grab something to drink, get comfortable, settle in for a minute. And soon there will be a companion workbook for decentering and deconstruction you can follow along with while you listen. But for now, let's begin. Welcome back to Auntie Sermons, Episode 6, Women of the Ark. Today we're returning to one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible, the story of Noah and the flood. It's a story about survival, about catastrophe, and about the rebirth of humanity. But there's something hidden inside this story that most of us were never taught to notice. 8 human beings survived the flood, and yet the text only names 4 of them. The other 4, the women whose bodies would literally carry humanity forward, are never given names at all. Today, we're going to slow down and look at the mothers of civilization, the women of the Ark. Auntie Sermons, Episode 6, Women of the Ark. One day when I was reading the story of Noah's Ark again after many years, I had one of those epiphanies where you don't actually learn something new. You suddenly realize you've known it all along. And for some reason, just writing about this right now makes me cry. That's how significant this epiphany is. I grew up believing that all of humanity came from the wombs of the women on the ark. Civilization itself exists because of these women, because of their bodies, because of what they endured, because of their pregnancies, because of their labor, because of their survival. And once again, the God of heaven and earth couldn't even give them fucking names. That was the epiphany. That the God I was taught to worship saved humanity, but couldn't bother to name the women whose bodies carried it. Do you know what that does to a child who has been abandoned by their parents? It made me constantly wonder what I had done to deserve the abandonment of the God of the universe as a little girl. It exacerbated my abandonment issues. The lack of the slightest consideration for women in this Bible cut deep. So let's read about the mothers of civilization. Genesis 6:18. But I will establish my covenant with you. You will come into the ship, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Genesis 7:7. Noah went into the ship with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives because of the flood waters. Genesis 7:13. In the same day, Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered into the ship. Genesis 8:16. Go out of the ship, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Genesis 8:18. Noah went out with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him. That's it. No names, no stories, no acknowledgement. Just bodies that exist to carry humanity forward. In those verses, Genesis tells us that Noah went into the ark with his wife and his sons' wives. The women are not addressed. They are not spoken to. They are not spoken about. They are simply there, lumped into the narrative like cargo, sometimes barely more distinguished than the animals they are boarding alongside. 8 humans survived the flood, according to the story. 8! And the text only bothered to name 4 men. That alone should stop us in our tracks, because if you believe this story even symbolically, then every culture, every people, every society on earth traces back not just to Noah, but to these women. Women who endured catastrophe, women who survived annihilation, women who rebuilt the world with their bodies. And the authors didn't think they were worth naming. Now, some people will say, well, the rabbis talked about these women. And they're right, sort of, because as we've seen before, when the text refuses to name women, tradition rushes in to fill the silence. In rabbinic midrash, specifically Genesis Rabbah 23:3, the rabbis decide that Noah's wife must have been Naamah, a woman mentioned earlier in Genesis. That identification is later repeated by Rashi, one of the most influential medieval Jewish commentators. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. The rabbis couldn't even agree on who Naamah was. We recently did a study on Naamah and learned her name comes from the Hebrew Naim, meaning pleasant or pleasing. And they argue she must have been righteous, a woman worthy of surviving the flood, a quiet helper behind a faithful man. We also learned that other rabbinic traditions say the exact opposite. They describe Naamah as dangerous, seductive, associated with music that led men to idolatry, a woman whose presence was morally suspicious. Same woman, same silence in the text. Two completely different stories. And none of it comes from the Bible itself. Because when scripture doesn't bother to name a woman, people feel free to project onto her their fears, their fantasies, their moral warnings. When women are unnamed, they become symbols instead of people. The rabbis weren't uncovering her story, they were inventing one. And notice this. Even when they talk about her, it's still never about her experience, not her survival, not her fear, not her body carrying humanity forward after extinction. It's always about whether she was pleasing enough or dangerous enough. And that's not accidental. Because in a world where women are not named, women are not allowed complexity. We are either righteous helpers or corrupting threats, saints or seductresses, never full human beings. Rabbinic tradition tried to rescue Noah's wife from anonymity, but it couldn't imagine her outside the narrow boxes patriarchy allows women to occupy. So yes, the rabbis spoke about these women, but even then they were still speaking over them. And then we get to what Christians teach about her. And this is where things don't get better. They just get quieter. Because unlike rabbinic tradition, Christianity doesn't even argue about who Noah's wife was. It mostly pretends she doesn't exist at all. In most Christian teaching, Noah's wife and his sons' wives are treated as narrative background. They're there because they have to be there. They exist to make the story work, but they are never examined, never honored, never asked about. Christian sermons about Noah are almost always about Noah. Noah's obedience, Noah's righteousness, Noah's faith in the face of mockery. Sometimes they talk about the animals. Sometimes they talk about the ark as a symbol of salvation. Sometimes they talk about judgment and wrath and rain. Mostly they argue about whether this was literal or metaphorical, but almost never do they talk about the women. When Christian teachers do acknowledge Noah's wife at all, it's usually to say something like, she followed her husband faithfully, or she supported Noah's calling, or she benefited from Noah's righteousness. She is framed as an accessory to a man's faith. Her survival is not her own. Her obedience is assumed. Her body, the body that would carry the future of humanity, is invisible. And unlike rabbinic tradition, Christianity doesn't even bother filling in the silence with imagination. It simply leaves the silence there and calls it normal. And this is important to understand, because Christian theology inherited a text that already treated women as property, already treated them as unnamed, already treated them as secondary, and instead of interrogating that, it sanctified it. Silence became holiness, erasure became humility, and women were taught that disappearing was virtue. So when Christian girls read this story, we aren't taught to see ourselves as the mothers of civilization. We're taught to see ourselves as helpers, as supporting characters, as beneficiaries of a man's righteousness. And if we feel unseen by God, the answer is always the same. Submit more, trust more, disappear more. And I need to say this clearly. Christian theology did not forget Noah's wife. It learned from the text that women don't need names to matter, and then used that lesson to justify generations of women being unheard, unnamed, and uncredited. That's not divine design. That's patriarchy with a halo. So if all of this silence feels intentional, if it feels like more than oversight, then the question we have to ask is this: is this the only way this story has ever been told? And the answer is no. Because while Jewish and Western Christian traditions preserved a version of this story where the women remain unnamed, other Christian communities preserved a different canon entirely. A canon that made a different decision about whose lives were worth remembering. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves one of the oldest and largest biblical canons in the world. And within that canon is a text called the Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis that was originally written in Hebrew, later preserved in Ge'ez, and treated not as commentary but as scripture. And as we have seen in the Hebrew text that names are not accidental, the same can be said for the Ethiopian scriptures. They are understood as descriptive, as reflective, as telling us something about how a person is remembered, not just that they existed. And when we turn to that text, something changes. The story doesn't become less theological, it becomes more human. Because in the Ethiopian biblical tradition, the women are named, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but plainly, directly as part of the story of humanity's survival. Jubilees 4:33. And Noah took to himself a wife whose name was Emzara, the daughter of Rachel, the daughter of his father's brother, in the first year of the 5th week, and in the 3rd year thereof she bore him Shem, and in the 5th year thereof she bore him Ham, and in the 1st year of the 6th week she bore him Japheth. Here Noah's wife is not an unnamed attachment to a man's story. She is Emzara. She has a name, she has a lineage, she has a place in history. Jubilees 7:1. And in the 1st year of the 3rd week of this Jubilee, Shem took to himself a wife, and her name was Sedekatelabub. Jubilees 7:2. And Ham took to himself a wife in the 2nd year of this week, and her name was Nahel Tamauk. And Japheth took to himself a wife in the 3rd year of this week, and her name was Adatanises. These women are not counted. They are remembered. Where Genesis says his wife, the Ethiopian Bible says Emzara. Where Genesis says 3 wives, the Ethiopian Bible gives us Sedekatelabub, Nahel Tamauk, and Adatanises. This doesn't suddenly make the story more literal. It makes it more honest about who carried humanity forward. And that matters because it shows us that erasure was never required by God. It was never inevitable. It was a choice. And some communities chose differently. And what we learn when we put these traditions side by side, rabbinic teachings, Christian teachings, Ethiopian Christian teachings, is not just that the texts are different. It's that women are valued differently depending on the lens through which they are seen. The same woman can be righteous in one tradition, dangerous in another, invisible in a third, and honored in a fourth. Nothing about her changed. What changed was the community doing the looking. And once we understand that, it becomes clear that women cannot afford to be passive about where we place ourselves. We have to be more selective about the communities we align with, more selective about the stories we allow to define us, more selective about the spaces that are allowed to name us, because the way a community sees women will eventually shape how women are allowed to exist within it. And frankly, it often changes how a woman sees herself. When I was a young woman, I was a restaurant manager. I worked at Denny's, and I was proud of that job. I was a single mother, not quite divorced yet because I was still tangled in the legal battles forced on me by an abusive man. I was trying to reset my life. I was trying to find my footing. At that restaurant, I had a boss named Shabir. Shabir was a Muslim man. He was very conservative, very religious, and very misogynistic. I had worked hard to learn that position. I started at Denny's as a hostess when I was 18. And I worked my way up through the company as a single mom in the early 90s. I was making decent money, especially for someone without a formal education. And because I didn't have that education, I couldn't afford to lose that job. It wouldn't have been easy to find another position that paid what I was making, offered profit sharing, and provided benefits for both me and my son. So I put up with a lot of misogyny from Shabir and from the men he hired. And this story, while it includes a man named Shabir, is not special. It's not unique to me. change the name, pick a different restaurant, a different decade, you'll still hear the same story. There are a few moments that have stayed with me. I remember one day when my coworker Tracy received a phone call telling her that her 11-year-old child had broken their leg at school. Tracy was also a single mother. We told her to get the hell out of there and go to the hospital. There were 4 managers working that day. We were a training restaurant for the district. We always had more managers than we needed. Shabir was furious. He said, if this had happened to me, I would still be working. That is why I hate working with women. Something happens to your child and you have to leave. I was livid. How dare he make her feel guilty for going to her injured child? How easy it is for a married man to say that to a single mother. Neither Tracy nor I received child support. Of course he wouldn't leave work. He'd make his wife go to the hospital. He'd see his child later after his shift. I told him if his child were in the hospital, I would tell him to leave and I would cover for him. But in his eyes, women were the problem. Always the women. Another day, during the Sunday lunch rush, right after church let out, I went looking for the other manager because I needed help. Shabir was busy training a new hire, and there he was, sitting in the back of the restaurant eating fried chicken in the middle of lunch. If you've never worked in a restaurant, let me explain how absurd that is. During the busiest hours, breakfast, lunch, dinner, it's all hands on deck. Nobody takes break during the lunch rush, least of all a manager. I was furious. I went to Shabir and I said, what the fuck? And he told me, you see that man sitting back there eating fried chicken? He used to work at Jack in the Box. He doesn't have anywhere near the experience you do. He will never be as smart as you. But this is a man's world and you need to get over it. That message followed me for years. Different men, different settings. Sometimes it was my father or my uncle. Sometimes my husband or my brother. Sometimes a cousin, a friend. Sometimes they said it out loud. Sometimes it was in what they didn't say. And then years later, I found TikTok. I didn't know what I thought that the app would be. I never imagined it would become what it has become for me. But through TikTok, I found a community. We call ourselves the deconstruction community. A large, diverse group of people dismantling harmful religious beliefs. And as many of us deconstruct from religion, we are also deconstructing misogyny. I won't pretend the work is finished. Even the men in that space will tell you that they still have learning to do. But what matters here is this. The way women are seen in this community is different. Some of the first people to recognize something valuable about me, about my voice, were men. Benny trusted me enough to invite me into building the Deconstruction Junction Discord server. Through that space, I met more men. Justin from Deconstruction Zone, who later founded the DZ Foundation and asked me to serve on his board of directors. I have met so many wonderful men in this community who are my biggest supporters. These men see through a different lens. They honor my name. They give me a seat at the table. They make space for my voice. And that difference is everything. And that's when something clicked for me. Because the way I'm seen in the deconstruction community mirrors what we saw earlier in the Ethiopian Christian tradition. Not because the people are perfect, not because the systems are flawless, but because of the lens being used. The Ethiopian Christian community looked at the story of the ark and chose to remember the women. They didn't invent myths about them. They didn't argue about whether they were dangerous or pleasing. They simply acknowledged their humanity and gave them names. In the same way, the men I encountered in the deconstruction community didn't ask me to shrink. They didn't require silence. They didn't need me to be useful in order to be valued. They saw me. They honored my name. They trusted my voice. And just like the women of the ark, nothing about me changed. What changed was a framework through which I was being viewed. Both communities made the same choice, to recognize women as full participants in the story, not background characters, as contributors, not accessories, as people worth naming. And once you've experienced that kind of recognition, even once, you can never unsee the difference. And this is what all of this has been leading us toward. When the Ethiopian biblical tradition chose to name the women of the ark, something subtle but important happened. It didn't suddenly fix everything. We still don't have their stories. We still don't hear their voices. They're still not the main characters. But the act of naming them changed how they are remembered. It told us in that community, these women mattered enough to be seen. And I've learned something similar in my own life. When I encountered men who saw me as their equal, not as an accessory, not as support staff, not as someone borrowing authority from them, something shifted inside me. I didn't suddenly become smarter. I didn't suddenly become more capable. I didn't suddenly find a voice I never had. What changed was the lens. It's like street photography. A photographer walks up to an ordinary person, someone who probably thinks of themselves as unremarkable, and asks to take their picture. And you might wonder, why me? What could they possibly see? And then you see the photograph. The light is different. The framing is intentional. The details are suddenly alive. And nothing about the person changed, except that someone chose to see them differently. That's what it felt like to be seen through a new lens. Not the lens I grew up with in Christianity. Not the lens that taught me women's names didn't matter. Not the lens that treated women as background characters in sacred stories. But a lens that said, you belong here. You are equal here. You are worth naming. And once you experience that once, you can't go back to believing that invisibility is normal. Because being seen doesn't just change how others perceive you. It changes how you begin to perceive yourself. And that's today's Auntie Sermon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, comment, rate, or review the podcast. It really helps more people find the show. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, check out my link tree in the show notes. There are several ways you can support the show and the work that I do. You can also find me on TikTok and YouTube. I am CrystalJae, CrystalJae. And remember, I'm Nice Lady.